to open this exhibition. I have to say, when I hear doctor, it does remind me of when I told my children that I had been so honoured. My eldest daughter wrote to me and said, "You do realise it takes a very long time to become a doctor, and please don't give any prescriptions." And I explained to her it was a slightly different type of doctor. I have great pleasure. I've had great pleasure in looking at DAPENG's work for many years, and I've enjoyed watching how he continually explores and develops the themes and ideas which he set as he searches for new ways to present subjects which interest, intrigue, and challenge him, including internal and external space and voids. Born in China, DAPENG's interest in painting and drawing began at the age of 4, when his father began to teach him to sketch and paint. As he grew up, his interest in art grew, fanned by constant and continued visits to the marvelous reservoirs of Chinese art in such places as the National Art Museum and the Palace Museum in Beijing. As well as encouraging his admiration in classical Chinese paintings, this also inspired his inspiration in the history of the art he sees. And as he began to read books on this subject, DAPENG realized that many of the scholars who had written them came from Australia, the UK, and the USA. This encouraged him to come to Australia and to do his own research into the history of classical and modern art in China at Sydney University. As he continued to study for his doctorate, he never stopped painting and drawing, and in 2014 chose to make painting his full-time commitment. DAPENG is a cerebral artist who reads widely. One of his great interests is in the philosophy of both the East and the West, including the writings of the Chinese Warring State Taoist philosopher Joanna, from one of whose philosophical stories his grandfather chose his name. He also is interested in European philosophy, including the works of André Descartes, whose writing encouraged DAPENG's interest in substance dualism, the relationship between the mind and the physical body, which is reflected in his work. He's equally interested in the history of colour, enjoying how to use the different colours and see how they change the viewer's impression of the art that is in front of them, the paintings that are in front of them. We can see that particularly in 2 works on paper, Light on the Mountain, magenta and blue, which are interestingly painted, oil paint on, oil paints on paper, which is a very challenging way to actually use oil paints, because it allows you no leeway. You can't make any mistakes. You have to just leave it as it is. There are two identical paintings, but both of them are used. There are different colours which are used, which produce a separate impact on the eye. And within them, there is the void into which you go and which is in your mind. The same can be seen in the Light of the Void 1 and 2, the same interest. While DAPENG remains deeply indebted to his rich heritage of classical Chinese painting, he is equally interested in the land and seascapes of his new home, Australia, and enjoys exploring the differences and the similarities between Australia and China, the new and the old. This, with his profound interest in internal and external space, sees him comparing geometric spaces created by nature and those which are man-made. He constantly challenges himself to search for new ways to present themes which interest him. For instance, while in his work, which pays homage to classical Chinese shan shui, instead of using traditional ink and brush on paper or silk, he uses paint on canvas and on Belgian linen, and even on paper, which is, as I say, completely different from the images that are used in China. And he likes the challenge of using something that is traditional, creating something that is traditional, but by using a different technique. He enjoys experimenting with different pigments to create colors which not only please him, but reflect colors which are seen in ancient Chinese paintings, but presented in a completely modern setting. Again, a mixture of old and new, in which he also likes to explore internal and external spaces. We can see that in mountain pavilions, where DAPENG uses the essence of the traditional classical landscape paintings to create a space which is both internal and external. The colour of the chair is subtly reflected in the wisps of the yellow which wind through the room and the landscape, encouraging the viewer's eye to travel through the interior architectural space and the exterior spaces of nature, presenting playful queries and enigmas. Are we looking at an internal or an external space, or is it two internal spaces? In the small, internally lit house sitting on the rock, is it outside or inside? With the addition of the eucalyptus tree that has intrigued artists from overseas since 1788, he creates a painting which blends the East and the West, China and Australia. In the journey from the mountain, DAPENG again uses the eucalypts in the foreground with their loose foliage, allowing the eye to travel beyond them to the seated figures, the camel train, the junks, and the mosque, a typical yet atypical Chinese landscape which combines East and West. While some of his works here are representative of traditional paintings, in others, DAPENG uses geometrical figures to create the landscape. These are not the hard-edged abstracts of the late 1950s or 60s, but his own abbreviated form of space. Many of them are inspired not only by the Chinese landscape, but also by the Australian coastline, which, while still showing preference to the old, also presents the new, as DAPENG creates his own observation of space and of the void. The uninhabited space 4 and 11, while creating abbreviated space, the painting nonetheless remains closely related to traditional paintings of mountains and seascapes. Like many of his paintings, these inspire the viewer to explore them with their own thoughts, encouraging them to inhabit them and let their minds wander peacefully through the mountains to find their own nirvana. In other paintings, DAPENG breaks the temporal and spatial boundaries to create a dialogue between different objects. He presents them using his own language and while taking a form of its own. They are part of his cerebral exploration, which is often drawn out by listening to music, which revives and relaxes him and recalls memories that turn into paintings. DAPENG is also interested in how shapes alter to the eye as light changes through the day, how a sudden sunbeam coming through a window can change the emphasis on an object it lights on. As we've seen, his primary interest is in how the use of different colours can be seen on identical geographical shapes can alter the feeling and and impact a composition. We can see this clearly in seascape and sun and skiscape and sunglasses. While the geometrical shapes are similar, here again, the use of different colours. In the use of different colours, we observe two different images. Painting is a deeply personal process, and often the artist feels the painting they are working on does not represent what they're striving to achieve, so they are abandoned or destroyed. DAPENG is no exception to this. However, he sees more in the tossed pieces that can be torn or cut scraps. He feels that nothing that has been created is irrelevant and gathers together the abandoned pieces from various works to create interesting new abstract images from these pieces, these spoils. He juxtapositions discarded lines and colours and by this he produces new works which give life once more to something which has been abandoned. In the reclaimed image here, DAPENG has created new and an interesting composition, giving life to something once more. His grandfather was prophetic when he named DAPENG after a mythical large bird with huge wings which soared above the earth. Because he has indeed soared and spread his wings, moving from China to Australia. DAPENG's works are unmistakably his own and a reflection of his dualism, melding the classical Chinese paintings and its ancient history with modern life in Australia. As the Anglo-American poet T.S. Eliot said of his work, it would not have been what it is if I'd been born in England, and would not have been what it is if I'd stayed in America. It's a combination of things. So too are DAPENG's paintings, essentially East, West, the ancient and modern, making it supremely and uniquely his own. Thank you.